behind every atom of this world hides an infinite universe. This sentence from Jalāl ad-Dīn Rūmī explains in a very short form what this video and the theories of Jean-Emile Charon are all about. Of course, the word atom didn't relate to the physical theories that we have today, but already the Greeks and other cultures introduced the basic idea that matter is made up of tiny invisible particles. But I have to admit that this video will be a bit challenging as it contains some explorations into the world of physics. In the first sections, I'm doing a short recap of basic physical principles. And then I'll explain how Charon's interpretation of the interactions of the hidden forces inside electrons with the formation of life works with my own understanding of a layered universe or the matrix of life. Jean-Emile Charon was a French physicist and philosopher. As an engineer, he initially specialized in nuclear research at the French Atomic Energy Commission, CEA. In the 1960s, he turned to fundamental theoretical physics and philosophy. He has written several books in French, but only 2 of them have been translated into English. I must mention here that this video is an extension of Charon's theory on the spiritual and, partly, also on the physical level. As always, this is my own interpretation of the subject, and we should keep in mind that Charon's ideas are not widely accepted in the scientific community. From a strictly scientific viewpoint, his work should be seen as a philosophical exploration of the intersection between physics and consciousness rather than a definitive scientific theory. In relation to the work of Jean-Emile Charon, the Rūmī quote, "Behind every atom of this world hides an infinite universe," is indeed quite remarkable, as it points directly to the core of Charon's theory of the relationship of the atoms to an infinite world or black matter. The only difference is that Charon identified the electron, which was unknown in the times of Rūmī, as the element that contains a gateway to the universe. An electron is a tiny particle with a negative electric charge. It orbits the nucleus of an atom, much like planets orbit the sun. Electrons are responsible for electricity and chemical bonds, making them fundamental to how our world works. They are also one of the smallest and lightest particles in the universe. Of course, in reality, electrons don't circle the nucleus like planets orbiting the sun. Electrons are strange particles, and because they have properties of both particles and waves, where they appear at any given moment is somewhat unpredictable. Think of it this way. Imagine a coin. Sometimes it looks like a head, particle behavior, and sometimes it looks like a tail, wave behavior. You can't see both at the same time, and what you see depends on how you look at it. And in Charon view, electrons are also like a tiny gateway to an infinite world. Now, let's start with Charon's view on how electrons interact with the universe without going into the details of how this should work in physics. Imaging an electron as a soap bubble, resting on an imagined surface, a bit as in this image. The imagined surface is the threshold to our normal space-time or gravitational space, and the electron creates a virtual universe unto itself alone, one where it's completely isolated from the exterior. But how can the electron interact with the outside? It happens through other electrons. Let's assume we have 2 electrons, as shown here. According to Charon, it happens through something that he calls photon gas, or black radiation, which is based on Richard Feynman's theory about virtual photons. And those virtual photons can exchange information with other electrons by an effect called electrostatic repulsion, as it is shown in this short clip. But this exchange of information is not limited to a specific region. An electron can potentially communicate with any other electron in the universe and beyond. This is because the electron has quite similar qualities as a black hole or antimatter. It creates a tiny other space-time. There's still one basic principle missing from Charon's theory, and that's the electron spin. Electron spin is a fundamental property that gives electrons a spin-like angular momentum and magnetic moment. It's important to understand that electrons don't literally spin like a ball. It is a quantum mechanical phenomenon. But for the sake of simplicity, I will refer to it as a spinning ball. As the electrons form the basis of Charon's theory, it was necessary to explain the basic principle of how they can possibly exchange information. But let me skip ahead about 100 pages in Charon's book and continue here with what kind of interactions an electron is capable of. He identified 4 psychic forces or interactions that organize living forms into entities of increasing energy or order: reflection, knowledge, love, and action. All of these interactions occur through the electrons within atoms, and each of these interactions has very distinctive properties, and they have a certain hierarchy of what they can do and how far their radius of influence can reach. At this point, I must mention that the following sections are not based solely on Charon's theories, but I have added my interpretation of the subject from a spiritual perspective. When I first read Charon's book, Spirit, The Stranger Inside Us, I was stunned by the fact that a physicist had discovered this connection between the spiritual and material worlds. I could never have imagined that this was even possible, and it was kind of amazing to me that Charon could recognize the same qualities in his so-called psychic forces as in what I and others call life forces. For a better understanding of the rest of the video, I suggest you watch my video on the life forces first. It may help you to better understand how Charon's psychic forces can influence life. But if we go back to the overview of Charon's interactions, or psychic forces, and link them to the corresponding life forces, we see that there is no counterpart to the vegetal life force. But another physicist, Michael Koenig, did add in his book Das Urwort a 5th force, which he called experience. Experience has similar qualities as reflection, but is already capable of creating something new. The lowest is reflection, which in my opinion is related to the material world. Then experience and action, which both are fundamental for the genesis of living organisms. Knowledge and love are already related to us and working in the ordinary and higher human life forces. We have already introduced virtual photons, which are capable of exchanging information with other electrons, but haven't yet explained that these photons, as the ones in our space-time, have a spin too, and those spins have some mathematical properties, as they can have positive or negative numbers. In this nice animation, we can see what in physics is called the angular momentum of light. We see this is a quite complex process, as it has more than one dimension. Let me start with the simplest interaction, the reflection, to explain the fundamental principles of Charon's theory. This image shows an electron with 3 virtual photons, of which one is sitting on the threshold of gravitational space. The process of reflection is limited to the photons inside an electron. There is only a spin exchange between 2 photons in the inner space-time of the electron, so the total spin of the electron remains unchanged. This somehow reflects the limitations of the material life force to increase order in a system. Charon chose the term reflection for this exchange process because a photon with spin +1 exchanges its spin with a photon with spin -1, which doesn't allow an increase of order or knowledge in a system. It is more like the mirroring of 2 photons. You might think that this psychic or material life force is quite limited, and that's true to a certain extent, but the material life force is the foundation of the universe, and so it must remain unchanged. Otherwise, the worlds that are based on matter would eventually collapse if their foundation suddenly behaves differently. Think of it as a simple computer chip, plus a basic instruction set that exists in an almost infinite number. All the higher levels of creation depend on these chips and on them working properly. So any form of intelligence at this level would be a fatal flaw. Now for the second layer, called experience, which is related to the vegetal life force, we need one more explanation. In a previous section, I explained the interaction between electrons with the help of virtual photons. Now we can see how an information, triggered by a virtual photon inside the electron, can force the electron to emit a photon into our world or towards another electron. From classical physics, we know that photons can transfer energy to electrons, causing them to move, change energy levels, or be ejected from atoms. These interactions are crucial for understanding various phenomena, including light's behavior, atomic physics, and many technological applications. What Charon did is that he added the idea that photons can carry different types of information to classical physics. In this respect, the interaction process of experience is an exchange of momentum of an electron with a real photon. As the experience of exchanging momentum with an external photon becomes an experience for the electron, it will be stored in the form of a new light pattern in its internal space-time. And in this way, an electron can learn different patterns that are transmitted to it via external photons. And this process, together with the reflection process, is what makes life possible. We must remember that in the plant world, photons play a crucial role. Think of photosynthesis or any form of metabolism, and only an input from the physical world, called experience, together with a reflection inside the electron, brings this vegetal brain to life. Even our autonomic or vegetative nervous system depends on the exchange of information at this level. But what makes this kind of primary intelligence possible at the cellular level? So the electrons that are part of the atoms in organic clustered molecules must somehow create this form of intelligence. Exactly how this interaction of electrons in their surrounding atomic structures works is still unknown. But I think that the processes of reflection and experience within the electron play a crucial role. You may think that this idea of a kind of vegetative brain is new, but it is quite the opposite. Aristotle's philosophy already included the concept of a vegetative soul in plants, responsible for nutrition and growth. This is a historical root of the idea of a vegetative principle in living things. As experience is a more passive force, action is an active one. It reverses somehow the process of experience. The electron selects a suitable photon in the external space-time in order to exchange a linear momentum with this photon and thus bring about a certain state of motion to it. This process can then be interpreted as an action of the electron, since the electron draws on previously stored experiences, which it reflects upon and which lead to a specific action. The described processes of experience, reflection, and action take place without an increase in negentropy or order in the inner spacetime of the electron, which means that the spin is still unchanged. If we are going back to the idea of a vegetal brain, the force of action completes the structure of organic life. But of course, these processes take place in a very complex and collective form, which means many electrons and interactions are involved simultaneously. From the perspective of the life forces, action is related to the animal life force, which makes sense if we consider the characteristics of this force. Plants interact with their environment through a vegetative nervous system in the soil via their roots and are deeply dependent on sunlight, as animals are mobile and have a more developed sexual life. So, in the animal world, being agile and active is crucial to survival, whereas plants have more hidden strategies to survive as a specific species. The two last interactions. Knowledge and love are insofar different that not only a linear momentum is exchanged, but there is also an exchange of spin states between the photons in the electron's internal spacetime and the outside world. Through this process, the electrons experience an increase in negentropy or to a higher degree of order. This means that not only is the real energy of the photon coming from the outer spacetime transferred to the electron, but also the spin of the absorbed photon. For instance, we have an internal photon with spin +1, and then an outside photon with spin +1 triggers the increase of the spin of the internal photon. The outside photon will then disappear, or return to spin 0, while changing the spin +1 of a virtual photon to spin +2. Through this absorption process, the electron internalizes, so to speak, the information received in the absorbed photon in the form of energy, momentum, and spin. From the perspective of the life forces, knowledge is indeed related to our human mind, or the ordinary human life force, as a piece of external information can be absorbed, stored, and processed to gain further knowledge. But we must remember that this form of human thinking is already far more advanced than most people are capable of, for it would require a certain amount of detachment from the constant pressure of the lower life forces. Communication by love, meanwhile, requires that there be two. Two to come together, two to accept the spin exchange. It's essential that the electronic space in each contributor, the memory engraved in this electronic space, can accept an elevation of spin of one of its photons, from spin 1 to spin 2, for instance, as in this example. And as happens in both electrons simultaneously, a photon in the second electron changes its spin from -1 to -2. Plus, in the electron a spin change occurs too. Put another way, there must be a certain deeper compatibility between the two memories seeking to mate to elevate their information content while increasing each other's negentropy. Each is giver and receiver at the same time. And for the phenomenon to happen, the two new configurations of spirit, the electronic memories, need to be consenting. The explanation of love. Up to this point, I have taken more or less directly from Charon's book, Spirit, the Stranger Within Us. But from now on, it is more or less my interpretation of the interaction of love or the higher human life force. Charon himself, as well as Michael Koenig, from a physicist's point of view, do not really see the interaction of love as part of a higher spiritual dimension. But if we go back to the overview of all 7 life forces, we see that the higher human sphere actually belongs to the higher life forces, and is therefore sometimes referred to as the first heaven. And from the color groups, we can see a total of 3 pairs. From the top, a pair belonging to the Creator and the messengers, then the 2 human forces, then the 2 forces belonging to the organic world, and finally the material life force. That the psychic force of love belongs to the higher life forces has some wide-reaching consequences in the interpretation of how this force interacts with us humans. Firstly, only when our soul, or the electronic memories of the spirit, in Charon's terms, reaches a state of love, do we have a life in the so-called eternity. Charon wasn't very clear about the extent to which any of his psychic forces have memory capacity. In my view, it is clear that the lower life forces are limited in their electron-based memory to the existence of matter. Whether it is matter on Earth or elsewhere is not important here, but what is important is that the universe is finite and so are these electron-based memories. Now, what is this love energy all about? Of course, it has nothing to do what we usually call love, but a lot of what love means in a religious context. Agape is a Greek word that refers to the highest form of love or charity, and the love of God for human beings, and of human beings for God. So this love interaction with electrons on a human level is about God's love for his creation, and especially for us humans. But because God is a very distant entity to us, he has created these higher life forces, and what I call the Q-mesh, to communicate with us and his creation. Q-mesh is a term I use to describe the function of what is known as the Holy Spirit. And this Q-mesh plays a crucial role in enabling this communication, for it is this mesh net, or rather this kind of Q-force, that makes this communion in love towards the lower life forces possible. For it is tempting to think that the interaction of love as the highest will simply overwhelm the rest of the life forces and all will be in harmony. But this is not the case. The dominant lower life forces within us are ignorant of any other form of interaction until the interaction of love can be deeply anchored in our soul. The Q-mesh is therefore the indispensable tool for training our soul and the interplay of the lower life forces in such a way that the force of love can finally enter our being. If we remember that the interaction of love needs at least 2 electrons to happen, we can imagine that in the context of a Q-mesh network, it would be possible that a network of dedicated people can possibly create a kind of greater gateway, so that these higher forces can be accessed more easily. And the knowledge interaction, or ordinary human life force, also plays an important role in this process, because knowledge anchors love. It is this knowledge that can guide us in our lives to make the right decision on our path to our true self. Let me end this rather long video with another Rūmī quote. Reason is powerless in the expression of love. Love alone is capable of revealing the truth of love and being a lover. The way of our prophets is the way of truth. If you want to live, die in love. Die in love if you want to remain alive. Mevlana Jalaluddin Rūmī.